would love to introduce my amazing panelists here. We have Nina Vasan, founder and executive director and clinical assistant professor of Psychiatry, Brainstorm, the Stanford Lab for Mental Health Innovation at Stanford University. Esther Dyson, angel investor and founder of Wellville. Gael Aitor, co-host of Teenager Therapy and podcast entrepreneur. And Tom Insel, the executive chair of Vanna Health and former director of the National Institute of Mental Health. So thank you guys for being with me today. We are going to discuss technology addiction and mental health, specifically as it relates to young people. So I thought I would start with you, Gael. Tell me about your own relationship to technology. Do you feel like you've ever veered into tech addiction, and how has it sort of affected your mental health?
Yeah, I think technology and social media has been a double-edged sword in my life. For one, it's been a way for me to spread my voice far and wide, to use it to rally a community of teenagers that are also struggling with mental illness and depression and loneliness, and bring them together in one platform to really help each other deal with overwhelming emotions. But it has also been the cause of extreme comparison. I think technology especially has been a crucial component that has really, more than anything, encouraged a lot of unhealthy habits. I mean, it has caused me to go and track my mood every single day for 3 months straight, just so I could understand how every time I go on Instagram, my mood drops, how every time I go on TikTok, there's a lot of anxiety that I get. And also, I noticed that every time my screen time is above 6, 7, 8 hours, that's a sign that my day is not going to be good. As soon as I know that my screen time is up there, it is a bad day, and I have kept track of that pattern, and I have become very aware that the longer and the more dragged on my screen time gets, the worse my mental health is.
That's amazing that you've been able to track that. Okay, so this is your anecdote. I feel like, I was looking into some of the research on this, and there's a lot of articles and panicky kind of headlines about teen mental health, but I also found a bunch of interesting studies, including this one from 2022 Pew Research that showed that the majority of teens credit social media with strengthening their friendships and providing support. I was wondering if I could hear from you, Tom. You've worked in the mental health space for so long. What are your thoughts on the research, and all of you guys, like how overblown, how much of this is a media narrative and how much of it is real concerning?
Yeah, happy to jump in on this, and Nina has a lot of experience with this as well. I guess by almost any standards, there is a crisis around youth mental health, and there are lots of metrics. The suicide rate's up about 60%. There are surveys done by the CDC and others that show something like 57% of young women, high school age girls, describing depression for long periods of time, sense of hopelessness. There are a range of ways of defining this, but if you have kids or grandkids, you probably have a sense that they're struggling. And is this being overstated? Perhaps in some ways. A lot of people are pointing to the CDC survey that was done at the peak of the pandemic, and it's likely that things are less urgent now, although I have to say, the number I often look at is the number of kids who, during the pandemic, rather than dying from the virus, which was about 8,260, died from depression, anxiety, or drug overdose, suicide, or an overdose. And that number is about, depending on how you cut it, about 165,000 in the same period of time where we lost 8,260 to COVID. So this is really an extraordinary source of mortality, which in a way that wasn't true 20 years ago. So yes, I think there's something there. What drives it? To some extent, you can see an increase in distress and in suicide overdose deaths that track with the increase in the use of social media. There's a clear correlation. But to say that that's a causation, I think now is really overstating the case. I don't think we have yet the data that completely explains what this generation is dealing with and why there is so much distress. And it's mostly in the form of depression and anxiety in that generation that's still under the age of 25. Nina is actually deep into this.
Yes, Nina, let's hear
your thoughts.
And how much do we think technology plays a role, or how much of it is just these outside other factors?
Well, Dr. Insel said it perfectly in terms of, there's a huge crisis, and we know that just given timing that social media obviously has a huge role to play. At the same time, I think that Gael said it really well, which is that, your point of, yes, people, all of us, teens and adults, do have a lot of connection and community that we get from social media, and that is really, really important, especially to the point of during the pandemic and even post-pandemic, where people haven't yet, returned to their pre-pandemic types of relationships and social engagements. And so it does serve a very important role. Folks who are talking to families in other countries and things like that, it's fabulous. But at the same time, you talked about social comparison. We see bullying, misinformation, incredible difficulties with body image issues. And so it really is, I think, we need to look at both. Obviously, there have been a lot of studies that show correlations between increased social media use and everything from, increased depression, suicidality, worsening of body image issues and all of this. But actually a few months ago, there was what we think is the first causation study that actually showed causation between specifically a relationship between Facebook use and overall declines in mental health and well-being, as well as actually decreased academic performance. And this was a study done at Yale, and I'm forgetting the first author's name, but we'll send it on the WhatsApp group if anyone's interested. So I do think that we're starting, and the reality is a lot of the research that's being done to try to see, exactly what is causing this and why. It's not the research expert is here. I would sort of say it's not the best. It's also very hard to test, for causation. But I think that we're starting to see some, and I'm sure in the next few years we'll see more.
I'm wondering if there's sort of, I feel like so much of this gets lumped in with social media or all technology, or, it's sort of under this big umbrella. And Esther, I'd love to hear from you, sort of your thoughts on, are there tech platforms that are specifically, sort of particularly detrimental, do you believe? And also you guys feel free to weigh in. Or, are there specific features on these platforms that are really bad? And what could we do to or are there platforms that are positive?
Yeah, I'd sort of like to go slightly meta on this.
Yeah.
And it's less the platforms, it's more the business models behind them. Are they selling advertising? Are they recruiting you to something? What's the non-stated messaging, if you like? So I started out as a techie, and I remember when the internet came in, I wrote somewhere, the internet is kind of like the internet / social media, it's kind of like a beer party. I was still thinking of my college days. You discover beer parties, and there's kind of 3 modes that happen. One, I go to the beer party, I meet a lot of friends, I find somebody to go out with, maybe several. It's really fun, and it's Friday nights, and it's great, and it enriches my life. Then the second is I discover beer, and I just sink into it. I start drinking way too much. I start whiskey, who knows, but I become addicted. And then the third is I discover beer parties, and I'm trying to pay my way through college. Oh my gosh, I can sell insurance to the other students for their dorm rooms and for their bedding or whatever, pet food, and it's a great business. So that's ultimately the way it still is in so many different ways. The challenge is, right now, our society as a whole has become addicted. One of you mentioned relationship. It's that relationship, and you're searching for short-term relief that you're not going to get. 6 hours, it's not going to get better with hour 7, but somehow you still do it. And you get both short-term in terms of time, but it constricts a lot of the rest of your life because you're so focused on this craving that you can't really fulfill for good, but you keep trying. Much more recently, I work in 5 small underserved whatever communities around the US. And what I see is community organizations are addicted to short-term grants. It's this notion of being bribed to do something versus intrinsic motivation. If you have intrinsic motivation and purpose and people need you, you think long-term about the results. But if you, again, if you're just being bribed short-term, the venture capitalists north of here are not addicted to building sustainable businesses. They're addicted to building body parts and selling them, otherwise known as exits. And it's a much broader social phenomenon of short-term thinking. We can give you instant results, whether it's a pill or a new dress. And kids who come in vulnerable often because their parents didn't give them a feeling of security. And yeah, it's random, but it's much, much broader. Social media is just the latest tool. It's now becoming, the business model is becoming more and more powerful as they start using AI to figure out what is it that's going to keep you really, really, really coming back. And I'm not scared of AI, but I'm scared of AI as business models. And what we need is, rather than focus on training or regulating our AIs, we need to focus on training our babies right at the beginning of their lives so that they understand their own motivations and they understand how they're being manipulated.
Yeah, that was kind of my next question. I'd love to hear from all of you guys on this, but like, who can fix this problem? Because I think, so much of it is often put on parents who are exhausted to kind of teach your child responsible social media use. And I don't know how much your parents weighed in on that. I think it's harder, to control kids than you imagine. So is this a problem for the government? Is this a parent problem? Is it something schools can, affect? Maybe we'll start with you, Tom, or work our way around.
Well, I think for one, part of the solution is if you want to battle technology addiction, you need to not only start with the software and a software update and more guidelines and restrictions, but also ways that you can take the relationships and the connections you build online and offline. And community building is going to be one of the crucial aspects. You see the loneliness epidemic that's raging and the youth mental health crisis, I'm sure, is just adding to this feeling of isolation. And so teenagers are alone. They go to the internet. They think maybe on hour 7, I'll make a connection that feels fulfilling. Maybe on hour 8, you're waiting for that text of someone that's going to get you out of this. But that text will probably never come because there are very limited opportunities to really build these connections in person. There's a lack of physical spaces for youth. There's not enough places outside of school and work where young people can interact and meet one another. And so a big part of the problem is that community building and physical communities aren't the most sustainable. To your point, what's the business model behind that? Who's funding this? Who's actually providing these resources? That's the biggest problem we've got to tackle if we really want to help young people make connections that aren't fueling their technology addiction, but are removing them from the online world.
And just to add to that, in terms of who's responsible, if we think about other forms of addictions, we realize that it really is a combination of multiple players. And in this case, it's all of the above. I think, Taylor, for what you said, there's an enormous role that the companies themselves need to play. Parents, kids, all users need to really better understand their own behaviors and work on their own sort of sense of regulation around that. And schools obviously play a huge role. And then finally, something that I know Dr. Insel's been active in is policy. We finally, in the last year, have the first both state and federal policies that both have started to pass and have some likelihood of being passed at the federal level around regulating social media companies and different standards in place at the government level. And really all of that has to happen. Given the magnitude of this problem, we need to have this kind of multimodal approach to solving it.
So I guess I want to get clear about what the actual problem is, because I'm not sure I fully understand what we mean by technology addiction, since there's gaming, there's social media, there's the use of email, which almost all of us are pretty addicted to at this point. And there's the use of tools that we all have, whether it's for getting information or driving or whatever we do. I think if the question is around social media per se and how that has become in some way toxic, especially for young people, I'm not sure I quite buy it, because there is that element. There's also just enormous benefit that we've seen, particularly for kids who feel like they're members of marginalized groups and may be literally physically marginalized, where they can find others who they can relate to. So I guess it's like any tool. It's dual use. There's upsides and downsides. In terms of regulation and solving the problem and the who and the where and the when, I just want to be really careful that whatever we put in place to sort of reduce those negative impacts doesn't end up precluding the benefits, which I think all of us know and all of us are quite aware of. I'm a little more concerned actually about gaming as an addiction, as something that people, addiction we define as something that you start doing because you want to, and you end up, when you're addicted, you do it because you have to, you need to. To use Esther's comment, you crave it in a way that's no longer a positive experience, but it's because you've lost agency. You're no longer empowered to be able to control it. It's controlling you. And we see that a lot with gaming, online gaming. And it is a big issue. It's actually maybe less so for kids and more for 20, 30-somethings, where this becomes a real preoccupation, ends up creating their own universe. They don't have relationships. They don't do anything else but that. And that's a problem. I think they're thinking about, how does one fix that? To Esther's point, there is a huge business model to promote it, not so much a business yet in trying to limit it. And I think for us, the challenge is, how do you take any of these things that are negatives and flip them around? How do you use social media to help kids connect with compassion instead of being able to bully each other? I mean, there are just real opportunities here that we haven't quite figured out. So before we get into how we regulate, I really want to think deeply about getting really clear about what's the problem we want to solve, and making sure whatever policies we put in place, and whoever puts them in place, thinks through, gosh, are we creating new problems by trying to attack this one? Esther, I'm sorry, you had your hand up.
It's okay. I totally agree with you, and I second you. I think one of the most evil companies around is Robinhood, which claims to be democratizing investing and is actually selling gambling without a gambling license. But where I would go, whose responsibility is it? Ultimately, it's the voters to elect people who will put in places policies that, most importantly, I think, will support families, parents. One of the most exciting things going on right now is Medicaid waivers across the country to pay for doula services to take care of mothers pre and post birth. It's inadequate, it's complicated, but that move towards understanding the importance of early parenting, helping, no one's going to stand up for mandatory parent training, though I would love that, but assisting mothers, paying for childcare, both so that the child gets cared for rather than stored, and second, so that the parent of that child not only can work, but can come home feeling confident about their child rather than feeling anxious about their child and about their job because they don't have time and they're paying too much. Having parents who are able to love their children, who themselves are not on their phones or worrying about money or arguing with one another or themselves getting addicted to something, it's a really long-term problem, and it has a really long-term solution. And the voters and then the legislators and the people who spend our money need to understand that you actually save a lot of money, and lots of studies prove that. We were talking about that last night, Tom. That's where we really need to focus, but we ourselves are too short-term. We need I crave an instant solution. Let me try it. No. Think about it long-term and solve it for real.
And moving upstream, Esther,
Yes.
right? I mean, that's really the key issue. I think so much of what we think about in the mental health space tends to be very crisis-oriented.
It's repair jobs, not
Yeah, they're
car
repair
maintenance.
jobs. But how do you move upstream? How do you keep people from jumping in the river rather than trying to save them when they're drowning downstream? And we do know what to do, but we're not doing it. And that, I think, is, I mean, it's to your point, thinking about how do you support new moms or new parents? How do you make sure every kid has access to pre-K? What are the things you can do early on to reduce those adverse childhood experiences that we know put people at high risk for addictive outcomes of all kinds, whether that's technology or drug-related?
I want to make sure we have time for a couple questions here. Are there any questions from the audience?
Yes.
I'd like to hear. Oh.
Hi, I'm Michelle. I am a teacher who has had the great opportunity to go into homes for many years and work with parents, families, and young people. And one of the things that my young people in the past have reported is a sense of not mattering or not being valued in the family structure, in school, and out in a bigger sense. How does that lens, in your opinion, play into the lens they have when they enter the social media space and the impact that has on them?
Well, I think for one, it can be even more crushing when you already feel like you're not adequate enough and you're not accomplished enough, and then you go on the internet and you see, you're just bombarded with videos of kids that are their age doing incredible things and remarkable achievements. And I think that it's the people that are entering this are already vulnerable youth, entering a space where it puts them more at risk to start negatively affecting their mental health. And I think that's why, to your point, it comes to about how do you support parents and making sure that they're educated enough to support the child in the correct manner and educate them on what they're going to encounter when they go on social media to ensure that they have a higher resilience towards videos like those and towards the negative effects that are comparison and finding these things that are just negatively affecting your mood.
So, next question here.
Hi, my name is John Payne. Thank you. It's a really interesting session. Having been a parent myself, I know that it's probably the hardest thing I ever did, and even though I was, relatively healthy and stable and so on, I made lots of mistakes. And you mentioned briefly the idea of sort of education for parents. And I must say it's the one thing that sort of baffles me the most about our society is that there's zero education. You just assume, you're on your own, you can do it. And I wonder if there's ever been, serious policy discussions about education for parents.
I mean, just for context, the church used to do it, or the synagogue or the temple. When you got married, you had some counselor giving you advice, asking you questions, are you ready? And so it was considered normal. Now you'd have to go for therapy, and it's whatever. Parent-teachers associations did that to some extent. Right now, I think there's nothing. I think that's really part of the problem. And I mean, I would love Mackenzie Scott to fund maybe not mandatory parent training, but yeah, it's doulas. Again, doctors, especially if you're not part of the top 10%, you don't have a pediatrician who recognizes you in the grocery store. You don't have the church people around you. And our society needs to figure out how to fund stuff that has a long-term return.
Yeah, it's so interesting. In many parts of the world, this is just automatic, and you're either part of a multi-generational family or there are tools put in place. People are always surprised when I tell the story, but when my kids were born almost 50 years ago in San Francisco, we had a weekly event where we gather at a community center with all the other parents who had become new parents and a social worker from UCSF. And we'd spend 2 hours, actually it was twice a week, Tuesdays and Thursdays, and half the parents would stay with the kids on the playground or outside. The other half would have a kind of session of sort of parent training, but also talking together about the issues. It was really spectacular. It became our social network because we were all walking or taking our kids into this local place. And it was kind of wonderful. I was amazed that when my kids had their kids, none of that existed. So it's so complicated that we used to do it, right? It's not that we have to kind of discover something that's never been done. We just need to go back to what we knew about 50 years ago and did on a regular basis. How that stopped happening, I'm not sure, but it's been a long time since those kinds of things existed. And it was really effective. And amazingly, 50 years later, we have kept up with some of the same families that we met in that very formative moment. So absolutely right. You don't, everybody does this kind of for the first time, and they don't do it well. So there's a great opportunity to create community around that.
All right, last question here.
Will Poole, a parent and a technologist, a comment and a question. Comment, my parents tell me don't smoke, don't drink. I tell my kids don't smoke, don't drink. It didn't have much effect. So what do we do about TikTok? Because I think we have a train wreck in motion we're all seeing. We see our youth being addicted to this and using it, and we see lots of negative things that are being documented, and the Chinese government has their thumb on the scale if they want to. But the parents or the government saying don't use it, not likely to have any different effect than what I experienced. So what do we do?
Do you think, I'm interested to hear also, like, TikTok is unique in the sense that it's not a social network, it's more of an entertainment platform. Do you find yourself, I'm just curious, like, Gael, like,
I think part of it is understanding and educating young people around the bubbles that they're in. And I think TikTok specifically, it is constantly putting you in these different bubbles, and if you continue to go deeper into it without active mindfulness about what you're watching, why you're watching it, and if you're enjoying it, it's going to be very easy to get influenced into the wrong thing. And so even when I see my younger sister who's a freshman in high school just kind of spend hours on TikTok, and to that point of, as a parent, you're not really sure how to support them besides telling them don't do it. Even as a sibling, I'm kind of like, what exactly do I do here? Where can I influence her in some way to use it more mindfully, perhaps? But I think for me, something that I think is crucial when we're talking about TikTok and technology with young people is just making them aware about the algorithms in places and how that is influencing what they see. And it affects the experience they have on the platform. She might get a lot more videos that have a more negative effect on her mental health. But if you choose to dig a little deeper, curate your page a little bit more, it can have incredible effects. You're seeing the emergence of things like the STEM tab, and that's when we go back to the question of part of the responsibility is on education, but also on our platforms to allow features that make it easier for us to get out of the negative bubble and into something that's a little bit more positive.
Yeah, I think it's no different than where we were with automobiles 60, 80 years ago. We still need the seat belts and the safety bags and all that to be put in place. And by the way, TikTok's just the latest. There'll be much better platforms, much more powerful platforms, believe it or not, coming. So we have to start thinking really carefully about all those safety features. Ideally, you'd want the companies to show some responsibility about this. So we'll have to put in those safeguards as well. In the very way that we did with the automobiles, it's really important to learn from that history.
I think, honestly, in terms of something explicit, the biggest safety feature is understanding what happens with your data, understanding how the algorithm influences you. You've been on 6 hours and it doesn't stop you, but at least you're aware of that, and it might influence your decision. Are you going to go watch, are you going to do TikTok more or go walk with a friend? Are you going to go look at the sunrise? Are you, helping kids understand not just their own motivations, but the motivations of the thing that's taking all their time.
So true, especially as we move towards more algorithmic feeds. Do you have any final?
That was lovely. What I'll add to that is we at Stanford have created the Stanford Social Media Safety Plan, And basically what it is it's really a way for both parents and kids to better understand their motivations, their use, what is coming up, what behaviors, what feelings in terms of when they see different things on social media, and it allows them to actually actively make changes to not only their feed, but their habits in general. And I think that level of insight is really important for all of us as we're using social media in a way that, sometimes we do get addicted, right? And things like having, different notifications saying it's time to get off, things like that are really important, but also just really understanding yourself better and what social media is doing to you.
You have time for one more question?
I think, I think we are totally out, but, I know at least Esther will be around, and Gael might be around after as well, so I'm sorry about that, but we are out of time. Speaking of having to go, thank you so much.